The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. This is Ron Mueller. I'll be starting this broadcast in about 2 minutes. So please, I'm going to thank you for getting on early, and please get paper and pencil ready because you're probably going to want to take some notes. I do not believe we're going to be able to record this. I left that in the hands of my assistant who's trying to get it to happen, but there was a technical problem, so I'm not sure. So we'll start in about 2 minutes. Okay, let's get started. You've got an important briefing tonight, and probably one of the most important ones I've done in a long time. So I'm glad so many of you have registered for this briefing. I'm going to take a minute to introduce myself because I know we have a lot of new people on this briefing that have not been on my webinars before. So I think like 1 minute to introduce who I am. And who I am is my expertise is in small business tax law. I've been doing this for probably 20 years, a little over 20 years. I'm the author of 4 books on the subject of small business tax deductions. I've spoken at hundreds of small business owner conferences, and I'm a tax savings coach to thousands of small business owners. I'm also the dean of the Small Business Tax Savings Learning Center, which is located at homebusinesstaxsavings.com. That's just a little bit about me. I want to also mention that if you would like to be on my list to be notified of future webinars, which we have on a fairly frequent basis, you can do that by signing up for my newsletter. It's free. TaxTipsYouCanBankOn.com is where you go. TaxTipsYouCanBankOn.com. It's a free newsletter subscription. You can opt out anytime you want to. I don't know why you'd want to because I send you tax tips on a frequent basis. But if you're not already receiving newsletters from me or emails from me, that's something you might want to do. Now, your briefing tonight is going to be delivered by a well-known colleague of mine and a longtime friend, Daniel J. Pilla. So you may be wondering, who's Dan Pilla? Let's take a look at who Dan Pilla is. First of all, Dan began his lifelong passion for helping people resolve IRS issues when he was about 18 years old. Dan likes to say he did what any 18-year-old would do when they saw the IRS abusing his father's business. He sued him. He sued the IRS and he won. That was the beginning of what turned out to be his lifelong career. Later years, his testimony before the Senate Finance Committee in the 80s blew the lid off the IRS abuse. And his testimony helped lead to new taxpayer rights and protections, including the current Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Dan has been protecting and defending taxpayers for more than 40 years, successfully representing hundreds and hundreds of all kinds of taxpayers in audit appeals and in federal tax court. He's authored some 15 self-help books, and probably more, I lost count, to empower people to defend themselves from unfair attacks by the IRS. His mantra is there's no such thing as a hopeless tax problem. And I'm sure a lot of people have thought they had a hopeless tax problem, and I don't know of any cases where the outcome was anywhere near as bad as they thought it was going to be when they first met Dan. I know I wouldn't go into an audit appeal or to a tax court without consulting with Dan. The Associated Press Worldwide Wire Service says, this is a quote, Dan Pilla probably knows more about the IRS than the IRS commissioner. His work is the final word on IRS issues. So I could go on and on about Dan Pilla, but I'm sure you'd rather hear from him than hear more about him. So I think at this point, it's time to turn it over to Dan. Dan, take it over.
All right, Ron. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your schedules here to join us for this web briefing. As Ron said, it's a very important issue that we're going to talk about that is not in, believe it or not, is not in the media at this time. It's issues that involve benefits for taxpayers that every wage earner needs to know about and every business owner needs to know about. And so that's what we're going to get into tonight here. And so I want to just take just a quick minute here. You can go ahead and change the screen, Ron. Take a quick minute here to stripe the field just very briefly. And I think everybody will agree with me. Everyone on this call right now will agree with me that March was a month of chaos in the United States, and it didn't get that much better in April, and here we are in May now, and we're starting to see some of this stuff wind down a little bit, but this has been the craziest thing that I have ever seen in my 40 plus years of dealing with the IRS, and specifically when it comes to the IRS and the chaos that we've seen with the IRS. You know, we saw two very significant legislative acts that came through Congress. The first one was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that was passed on March the 18th, and then we saw the so-called CARES Act, which was passed later. The Coronavirus Response Relief Act that was passed later than that. That was passed after that. We saw all kinds of administrative decisions and administrative notices coming out from the IRS that are giving people tax filing extensions and tax payment extensions. Of course, you've heard about all of that stuff. I'm not going to get into all of that, but this is kind of the background of what I want to talk about here, because what we're going to talk about is something that nobody is talking about. And this is something that everybody needs to know about. I call it the hidden gem in the tax code. And that hidden gem that's in the tax code that is just completely overlooked in all of this chaos that we're living through right now is Code Section 139. Now you say, well, what the heck is Code Section 139? Who's ever heard of Code Section 139? Well, first of all, I don't pretend that most people know anything about the numbers that are in the code. You know, there's over 4 million pages, or words, I should say, 4 million words in the Internal Revenue Code has been changed more than 5,900 times just since 2001 alone. And so, you know, it never surprises me that people never heard of this or that. But in this particular environment that we're in right now, it's borderline disgraceful to me that people are not, that the talking heads out there are not informing everybody about how Code Section 139 works. Code Section 139 was added to the Internal Revenue Code after the September 11 terror attacks on the United States. Of course, we all remember what that was all about, and we all have vivid memories of those situations. And then, of course, Congress got together, and there were a number of laws that were passed on the heels of that. And one of those laws was a tax amendment that added Code Section 139 to the Internal Revenue Code. This was added specifically in response to these terrorist attacks of September 11th. This code section allows employers to provide direct financial assistance to their employees. Now, the key about the unique aspect of 139 is this. There's nothing earth-shaking about the idea of employers providing employee benefits to their workers. We see that all the time. There's all kinds of benefits that are paid to workers. What's unique about Code Section 139 is that this specific provision expressly overrides the general rule that all compensation that's paid to workers as benefits for their as compensation for their services is taxable. So 139 allows employers to be made, allows payments to be made tax-free to employers. Now, you know, again, there's certain other aspects of the Internal Revenue Code that allow this, but we're going to get into this deeply, and you're going to see how much broader this is than any other section of the Internal Revenue Code that is on the books. I mean, there just isn't any one section that's any broader, any more beneficial than this is. The other thing that 139 does, and this is one of the unique differences, is that it relieves employers from any employment tax liability on the payments that they make to those workers. All right, so this is the critical thing about 139. This is the only provision in the tax code that exempts certain disaster payments from taxation. And so now, the basics of 139, let's talk about that. Ron, if you'll back up a slide, please. Back up to point number 2. There we go. All right, so the basics of Code Section 139 allows employers to make disaster relief payments to employees. Now, notice the fact that I have the phrase disaster relief in parentheses. That phrase disaster relief is in parentheses because that's the critical element of what's going on here. In order to get the benefits of Code Section 139, the payments have to be made for disaster relief. All right, and when disaster relief payments are made, the payments are not taxable to the employee and they're fully deductible to the employer. Now we're going to get into exactly what this means and how this shakes down. But the payments can cover any reasonable and necessary expense that results from a disaster. All right, so this is a pretty broad situation here. Any reasonable and necessary expenses, we're going to drill into what that phrase means and how that works, because that's something we see in the tax code all the time, reasonable and necessary. All right, and so we're going to look at that and drill into that. But the fact is that Code Section 139 very clearly states that gross income, we're talking about the person now who receives the benefit, that gross income, that benefit is not gross income to that individual. They don't have to put it on their tax return. They don't have to claim it as taxes. It's not included in any amount received as long as it's a qualified disaster relief payment. So now, Ron, go ahead on to slide 3 now. So now the question is, point number 3 here. Now the question is, what constitutes a qualified disaster? All right, a qualified disaster has to be involved with the payments in order for these things to be completely non-taxable. Now, when we think of disaster, we ordinarily associate that word with natural disasters such as fire, flood, hurricane, tornado. Any of these types of things certainly are included in the definition of disaster. Anything that's caused as a natural result of weather consequences and so on certainly is a natural disaster. Also included in the definition were terrorist attacks. All right, terrorist attacks are specifically included because remember, this bill came about expressly because of the terror attacks of 9/11. So that is typically a disaster. But Section 139C is much, much broader than that. All right, it's much broader than just simply fire, flood, hurricane. All right, because under Section 139C, the definition of a qualified disaster also includes any event. All right, look at those words. Any other event which is determined by the Secretary of the Treasury to be of a catastrophic nature. All right, so there's no limitation to what that might mean. Now, how does this apply to our current COVID-19 situation? Well, it applies very simply because on March the 13th, 2020, President Trump issued a declaration of a national emergency. He invoked the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, all right, declared an emergency. And friends, he didn't declare an emergency in just a few counties or 1 or 2 states. The National Emergency Declaration, the disaster area covered by this emergency declaration covers the entire United States and all of its territories. So every single one of us living in the United States or in a U.S. territory is covered by this disaster relief. It applies to everybody out there, every single person. All right, so now let's go on to point number 4, and let's talk about what exactly is a qualified disaster relief payment? All right, we know that disaster relief payments made to employees do not constitute income to the employee, but let's talk about what those payments look like. All right, so I've got 4 specific categories here. You see 3 of them on your screen. We'll get to the 4th one here in just a second. But the 4 specific categories that constitute qualified relief payments fall into these categories. First of all, if it's a payment to reimburse or pay reasonable and necessary, there's that phrase again. We'll talk about that in a minute. Reasonable and necessary personal, family, living, or funeral expenses incurred as a result of a disaster. So if you've got any expenses, friends, that you have incurred as a result of this COVID situation that you otherwise would not have had, then those expenses qualify as disaster relief payments under Code Section 139, and they can be excluded from income if they're reimbursed by your employer. All right. Now, number 2, any expense or reimbursement, any reimbursement to pay reasonable and necessary expenses incurred to repair or rehabilitate a personal residence or repair or replace its content to the extent attributable to the disaster. So again, if we've got a situation here where you have had to make specific changes to your home to accommodate any element of this COVID situation, to accommodate stay-at-home issues, maybe you've got elderly parents that had to come to live with you for some reason or another, you've had to make significant repairs or rehabilitation or so forth to your home to accommodate that can be included. Now, number 3 on our list there, this is specifically, number 3 is specifically pointed at common carriers. In particular, airlines is what the Congress had on their head when they wrote the bill back in 2000, late 2001. So in this situation, any payment by a person or a company, all right, this would be a payment from a company that's engaged in furnishing the sale of transportation as a common carrier by reason of death or personal injury as a result of its contents and so forth. All right, so this one is probably not going to apply to most of us listening here. And then we go to number 4, the next screen, Ron. The number 4 on our list is if the amount is paid by a federal, state, or local government or government agency in connection with a disaster in order to promote the general welfare. Now, this is this might be, for example, the payments that have been coming from the federal government in various forms. Of course, the unemployment compensation is not going to count because that's specifically designated as unemployment compensation. But any other benefit that you might receive from a government agency is going to be included in this list of what constitutes qualified disaster relief payments. The proviso here, point B on the bottom of your screen, the proviso is that these same expenses cannot be subject to be reimbursed by insurance. So you can't double dip from the standpoint of having your expenses covered by insurance and then at the same time having them reimbursed by your employer. All right, so now let's go move on to slide number 5, Ron. Point 5, what kind of expenses can be reimbursed? Now, this is where I want to get specific. I want to get detailed. I want to spend a little time here on this and talk about how this is going to shape up for an individual. All right, now these are just examples. This is not the statute talking here. I want to be clear about this. My slide number 5 is not coming out of Code Section 139. This is my application to 139. All right, so this is how I'm putting it into practice here. And I want to talk about the specifics that grow from this idea of any expense associated with COVID. Number 1 on the list, of course, is medical expenses. All right, if anybody is incurring medical expenses as a result of COVID, this would include insurance co-pays, deductibles, medications, vitamins, supplements. If you've got unique dietary needs, for example, you've got issues with your immune system and your medical professionals have advised you to engage in a particular dietary practice that requires specific foods to boost your immune system or vitamins and supplements to boost your immune system as a defense against COVID. That would be a disaster. That would be an expense related to COVID, a disaster expense that could be reimbursed by your employer, or if you are the employer, you could reimburse your employees for those expenses. So this is very, very broad. There's just no question about that. Obviously, if you have to go through COVID testing as a result of your job, if you've got to go through COVID treatment as a result of your job, God forbid, if you've got to incur expenses in connection with personal protection equipment because of your job, these are expenses that are disaster-related expenses that can be reimbursed. All right, so point B on the outline there is any increased expenses associated with being quarantined at home. All right, now this might include this might include increased utility bills, home health care visits, and so on. I mean, we've got people all over the country, my cousin being one of them, who can't go to the doctor now because most of the clinics have been shut down. So his personal health needs have had to be attended to by a home health care professional that would come to his house and do the various things that he needed to have done. And of course, there's expenses related with that. Now, some of that's going to be covered by insurance, no question about it, but he's going to have co-pays associated with that stuff that isn't covered by insurance. And that is a disaster expense that can be reimbursed by his employer. And it's a benefit underneath under this particular provision here that we're talking about, Code Section 139. Likewise, if there's any special living arrangements that need to be that need to be dealt with to accommodate the shutdown situation, the quarantine situation, I mentioned very briefly this the possibility that you have an elderly parent that's living with you now specifically because of this COVID situation. They couldn't live in their own apartment. The quarantine situation was such that they had to come home to be with somebody. You know, we're dealing with that situation with my mother right now. What do we do about that? And you know, she's in this situation where she can't really take care of herself, but we can't get into the assisted living place to help her because of the shutdowns, and she's so alone. And now what kind of living arrangements do we have to make for her because of this quarantine situation? And those are expenses associated with COVID-19 for sure. Number C on my point number C on my list on your screen there in front of you. Any expenses associated with setting up and maintaining a home office. How many? Show of hands. I can't see anybody out there. Show of hands. How many of you are working from home now that otherwise would not be working from home, and you've had to set up some kind of a makeshift home office? There's millions of people in America out there today that are functioning from their home that otherwise would not have been functioning from their home. My daughter's husband is one of them. All right. He was obviously sent home. He's working from home. They don't have a home office facility in their house. They had to go out and get a desk. They had to get a chair. They had to set these things up. All right. So if you have incurred these expenses with setting up a home office, then those can be reimbursed under this program as well. And I'm not just talking about furniture. Obviously, that's a main issue. But what if you need to get enhanced internet connections? What if you had to buy computer equipment itself? You got to get office supplies. We talked about furniture already. All of these maybe you had to put in a fax line. Maybe you have to pay for a electronic fax and e-fax service right now in your home that you didn't have to pay for before. And now you've got this e-fax expense that you otherwise didn't have. These are all expenses, friends, that can be included in this 139 benefit package that we're talking about here. Now, here's an important consideration here, is an important footnote. I talked about home office, all right? You can get home office expenses reimbursed. As the employee, you can receive the reimbursement. As an employer, you can make the reimbursement to your employees, even if the employee, now listen to this, wrap your head around this. This is a huge deal for millions of people. This is true even if the employee does not otherwise meet the requirements to have to qualify for the home office deduction. Now, I'm not going to go through all of what the requirements are to be able to have a quote-unquote home office deduction. All right, I talk about those in my book, Dan Pilla Small Business Tax Guide. Ron's got an excellent treatment in his book on the issue, Windfall Tax Savings Approved for Small Business Owners. And so we've got this discussion in our materials as to what constitutes a quote-unquote deductible home office. But we're not talking about a deductible home office here, friends. We're talking about disaster expenses that are reimbursed by your employer specifically, or reimbursed by the employer, either for the employee or by the employer, either way. We're talking about these expenses that are specifically related to COVID-19. All right. And so these qualify as being excluded from income under Section 139, regardless of the separate home office rules. All right. So let's move on here. All right. Point D on my list, non-perishable food supplies or emergency food or water. If you're in a situation where you've got limited access to grocery stores, you've had to stock up on some food. Lord knows we all have a garage full of toilet paper. Specifically as a result of COVID-19. I don't know why toilet paper got to be such a sensitive issue, but there it is. But any of these types of things related to COVID-19, childcare expenses. Here's another thing. Suppose you're an essential worker and you've had to go to work all this time, but we know all the schools shut down, kids are at home. And now we're winding down the education season now anyway. But the fact of the matter is, if you incurred expenses that you had to, that you otherwise wouldn't have incurred because your kids were at school, but then they had to go to childcare, or you had to bring somebody into the house to take care of your kids at your own expense, those are expenses that can be covered under this 139 plan. All right, so we've got expenses to address mental health, well-being. Listen, one of the biggest problems that we have in America today, friends, as a result of this isolation is depression. We are seeing so much more depression manifested in America today as a result of this isolation. People were not intended to be alone. People were intended to be in fellowship with one another, both in the sense of families, in schools, in churches, in particular in churches, and then of course in our workplaces. Of course, the governments have shut all the churches down. That's starting to loosen up now as organizations are pushing back. Our governor here in Minnesota just pushed back a little bit as a result of some very pointed letters that were sent to the governor by the Catholic and Missouri Synod Lutherans here in Minnesota, and caused the governor to push back on churches. But the fact of the matter, friends, is we are having substantial increases in mental health problems related to this isolation that are turning into depression. And to the extent that people are out there, dealing with that and trying to get professional psychological or medical help with this stuff, then those are expenses directly related to COVID. And the last thing on my list there is alternative transportation to replace public transportation. Let's again suppose that you're a critical worker that's had to maintain the process of going to work every day, but you work in a big city and you can't use public transportation. All right, now you got to drive your car into work every single day. What are the added expenses on your transportation costs, because you got to pay for parking downtown every single day? I was on the phone with an IRS person yesterday. Certain elements of the IRS are still functioning, and I'm dealing with the IRS lawyers' offices on a regular basis. They're working from home. I'm dealing with their appeals officers. They're working from home. Well, I was in a conversation with an appeals officer yesterday who's working from home. He lives in the San Francisco area. His main office is downtown San Francisco. All right, it costs $40 to $50 a day to park your car in downtown San Francisco. There's no way that this guy is going to incur that cost when he can work from home. But some of you can't work from home. Some of you have to continue to go into work every day, but you can't use public transportation. And so now you've got to incur substantial additional costs to operate your own vehicle to do that. These are all expenses, friends, that are related to COVID-19 that could be reimbursed by your employer, or if you are the employer, you can reimburse them to the employee, and they are not taxable. This, to me, is a magnificent benefit, and nobody's talking about it. So I want to get the word out there so people understand how this stuff works. And so now, Ron, we can go on to the next slide here if you'd like. All right, let's talk about the key benefits to the employer. We talked about benefits to the employee. The benefits to the employee, just to reiterate for 1 second before we plow into slide 6 here. The key benefits to the employee, friends, are real simple. All of these benefits that are reimbursed by your employer are not income to you. It's tax-free money that you get from your employer as long as there's a direct connection between the expense and COVID-19. That's all you got to do is bridge that gap. And we're going to talk about doing that, all right? We're going to talk about how to do that, but that's all you have to do is bridge that gap between the expense and COVID-19, and these are tax-free benefits. Now understand, there's a difference between tax deductible and tax-free. As far as the employee is concerned, you don't put it on your tax return as income and then write it off someplace else and only get marginal benefit for it. That's not how it works. You don't have to report this as income at all. So it's as if you got free money. That's what it is. Now, let's get into point 6 here, slide number 6. The key benefit to the employer is there's no employment tax liability. All right, so not only do you get to make the benefits payable to the employee, right, but you don't have to pay employment taxes on these benefits. That means you don't have to pay the matching Social Security or the Medicare, and they're not considered wage income for purposes of unemployment taxes. All right, you don't have to account to the IRS for the expenses that are reimbursed. In other words, they don't go on Forms W-2 to the employee. They don't go on Form 1099. If of course, if you got an employee, it wouldn't be on Form 1099 anyway. But the point is that you don't have any separate reporting requirements. I'm sorry, Ron, did you have a question?
That means that the income is reimbursed to the employee by the employer. Doesn't even show up on the employee's W-2 or 1099?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It does not even show up. All right. Not only does it not show up there, the employer does not report it on Form 941 to the IRS. So there's no Social Security or Medicare tax that's on it. Now, here's the next benefit for the employer. This is benefit for both the employer and the employee, frankly. There's no cap on the amount of expenses that can be reimbursed under this Section 139. All right, and they're deductible to the employer. So the employer gets to write off the expense, just as if you would write off any other payroll expense, doesn't have to pay the Social Security or the Medicare tax on it, and there's no cap. So the employer can pay $500, $1,000, whatever the situation warrants, and this has got to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But all of these benefits, friends, are paid by the employer, and they're deductible by the employer, and they're not income to the employee. The benefits, as I said, can be in any amount. However, and here's the caveat, they must be reasonable and necessary in light of the COVID-19 situation. All right, that's the key right there. And then the final point on the outline, I pounded on that already, is that the payments are fully deductible by the employer.
Question?
Yeah, you got a question, Ron?
Yeah, can we, let's look at this a little bit more. I mean, it says that there's no cap on the amount that can be paid, and it's not going to be reported to the IRS as income, and yet they require it to be reasonable and necessary. How will they even know what the expenses were?
Well, the only way the IRS is going to know is if they challenge the distribution, if they challenge the employer's distribution. Because remember, the employer will write off the expense. So if the employer does fall under IRS audit, the IRS will require the employer to demonstrate that these expenses were COVID-19 related, that they were paid under the Section 139 benefit, and the employer will have the burden of proof. We're going to talk about, Ron, you're getting ahead of me just a little bit, but that's okay. That's perfectly fine, because if you ask the question, then other people out there have the same question, and that's okay. But we're going to talk about the burden of proof here in just a second, and I'm going to drill into that a little bit more deeply as to what all, how this shakes down as far as proving it to the IRS is concerned. All right, so that moves us to point number 7 here. What expenses cannot be reimbursed? All right, now these are things that we got to pay attention to. Here again, the first thing on my list, expenses that are not reasonable and necessary. Everything that is not directly related to COVID-19 cannot be reimbursed. There's got to be that direct link between your expenses and COVID-19, and they have to be reasonable. All right, and again, what constitutes reasonable? What does that really mean? We're going to get to that. We're going to drill into that. No question about that. Expenses that constitute specific income replacement. All right. So if your employer is paying your wages, even though you're not working, then that is not a COVID-19 disaster benefit. That's payment for wages, and that remains taxable income. Likewise, the unemployment benefits. If you're getting the $600 a week unemployment that the federal government has authorized, and they're back at the drawing board trying to extend that, if you're getting those payments, those do not constitute COVID-19 Section 139 disaster payments. All right, any expenses that are reimbursed or reimbursable by your insurance or by somebody else for some reason can't be claimed as non-taxable under Section 139. So as you can see, there's a pretty narrow list of exceptions, except to the extent that what does that ordinary and necessary thing really mean? And that's what we're going to get into here in just a second here. So we can move on here to point number 8 on the outline. And this is another, quite significant benefit of Code Section 139, and that is that Section 139 imposes no duty on the employees to substantiate the actual expense to the employer. Now, here's what I mean by that. Normally, if you've got an expense reimbursement plan with if you're an employer and you've got an expense reimbursement plan with your employees, or if you're the employee and you get your expenses reimbursed by your employer, normally that's a quote-unquote accountable plan. And what that means is that in order for the employer to write off the expense, in order for the employee to count the expenses as not taxable, you have to account to your employer as to exactly what those expenses are and how they relate to business. That's an accountable plan. Code Section 139 creates no duty on the employees to substantiate the actual expenses. All right, all you got to do is make a request to your employer that says, these were my expenses, this is what I'd like to have reimbursed. All right, but, and that gets to this thing that I've been teasing you about here for the last 20 minutes, and that is they have to be reasonable and necessary. The reality, friends, is this. The hard reality is if the IRS, if for some reason you come under audit and the IRS sees deposits to your bank account, let's say they see $2,000 in the month of May and they see another $2,000 in the month of June, and they say, oh, you didn't show that as income, and your defense is, well, those are 139 expense reimbursements, then the IRS will require you to show reasonable and necessary. So the burden would be on you to establish that. So we have to keep in mind, friends, that the IRS could, I won't say they will, but they very likely could look at this stuff, and you have to be prepared to answer the question, was this stuff reasonable and necessary? All right, the IRS can question that, and the burden of proof is going to be on the individual, depending who the IRS is looking at. The burden of proof is on the individual to establish that the expenses constitute 139 expenses. And so you're going to have to keep some records. When I say there's no duty to substantiate, I'm talking about there's no duty to substantiate to the employer. All right, but you may have a responsibility to substantiate to the IRS if they look at this later. So let's look at this from the standpoint of both the employer and the employee. The employer may be audited because anybody with a pulse that's running a business is subject to audit. We all know that. Anybody that's running a business can be looked at. And so the IRS may say, well, you've got these payments to these employees that didn't show up on your 941s. What's that all about? It will be your responsibility as the employer to show that you reimbursed expenses under 139 to have those excluded from taxation. Now let's change the hat around for just a second. Now you're the employee who received the reimbursement, and the IRS looks at your bank statements and sees this extra $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 deposited to your bank account that doesn't show up on the W-2 form. Hey, what's this income all about? It's your responsibility to substantiate to the IRS that these were expense reimbursements under 139. So let's not confuse the substantiation requirement here. There's always a substantiation requirement when you're dealing with the IRS, and the burden of proof is always on the taxpayer. All right, the IRS never has to prove you did it wrong, friends. You have to prove you did it right. And so there is an important caveat there with respect to that. So Ron, we can go on to the next slide. Ron, can we go on to slide 10?
We're on slide 10. Okay.
Yep, there we go. Burden of proof. All right, yeah. So I got ahead of myself here in the outline, but the fact of the matter is that I want to build on this a little bit more, because my point A is very important to this. I'm sorry, Ron. I did get ahead of myself. We got to go back to 9. I messed up. You were right. I was wrong. There are no double benefits here, friends. All right, there's no double benefits. So if the tax code provides benefits under any other section of the tax law, then the employer can't take advantage of the same expenses under 139. So you can't double up here. There's no double dip. Now I give an example of a paycheck protection loan. Show of hands, how many employers out there, how many small business people got their PPP loans? A lot of them. There are millions of loans that were given by the Small Business Administration here in the last 60 days under the Paycheck Protection Program. So to the extent that you're using that money to pay your employees, then those specific payments are not going to be deductible. On the other hand, if you use other money, non-PPP money, to pay 139 expenses, then those expenses would be deductible. The employer's got to distinguish between employee compensation and disaster relief benefits, all right? You can't claim a deduction for compensation. You can only claim the deduction for disaster relief benefits. Go ahead, Ron. All right, so there we go. We're back to Jared. Ron and I are working without a net here, friends. So we're on 10 now. Now we're up to 10. All right, so now this is from the employer's point of view now. There's no specific documentation that's required by law to set up or operate a disaster reimbursement plan. This is not like a 401k where you set up and there's 2 inches of paperwork you have to get signed and you got to go to the bank and you got to do all of this stuff. That's not at all the case with a Section 139 reimbursement plan. I mean, there's nothing that's required under the statute. It's just clean and simple. And so all you have to do technically is write a check. Now, I don't recommend you do that. If you're an employer listening to us here tonight, my recommendation is that for best practice purposes, you should have at least some kind of written plan. Now, this doesn't have to be a 30-page document, friends. All it has to be is a simple explanation of what the type of expenses that you, the employer, are willing to reimburse to the employee, all right? So describe what costs are going to be reimbursed. This could be just a couple of simple paragraphs or a simple sentences or maybe a bullet point list of things that you're willing to reimburse. And then you should set up an application process. Again, it's not like applying for a mortgage to buy a house. That's not what I'm talking about. But just a simple form that you ask your employees to fill out that says, these are the expenses I'd like reimbursed. Here's the connection between my expenses and the COVID-19 situation. And then the application should include a statement from the employer that the funds are necessary to deal with their disaster costs so that we can clearly distinguish these from wages. All right, it's your responsibility as the employer to make sure that we distinguish these disaster relief reimbursement expenses from wages. They are not wages. All right, and then there should be a declaration by the employee that the expenses are not subject to reimbursement by the insurance company. Keep in mind, friends, that the burden of proof is on the taxpayer. As I said a minute ago, the IRS never has to prove you did it wrong. You have to prove you did it right. All right, now with 139, the good news is there's not a lot of complicated rules. It's pretty simple, and it's got very broad application. In conclusion, this is very, very broad application. All we have to do is create a colorable link between the expenses you're reimbursing and the Section 139 disaster relief benefit. It's very easy to administer. We just went through a few simple points here as to what I think this thing needs to look at. It's very favorable from an income and employment tax treatment. It's not income to the employee that you reimburse. As the employer, you don't pay Social Security or Medicare taxes on it. All right, so you get the deduction as the employer. The employee doesn't have to claim it. You're not taxed on the, I mean, this is just the best possible scenario here for expense reimbursements. And so I would just encourage you, if you're the employer, you should consider taking advantage of this tool to help your employees. And if you're the employee, then I would encourage you to sit down and talk to your employer about a program such as this to help out yourself and your fellow workers. And so that's my presentation, Ron. If you've got some questions, we can take those questions. Otherwise, Ron, you can take it back from here.
So one question, one comment, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
The question is that back on, I forget what slide it was, but you said that this is this emergency this became this triggered the 139 section. on March 13th when was the proclamation of this being a national emergency.
Yeah, that was March 13th, Ron. That was when the president invoked the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. That's what triggered the 139 benefits.
So if someone who has incurred some expenses that would have been reimbursable, go back to March 13th and could their employer reimburse them for those expenses from March 13th until now?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. I think as long as it's done within the calendar year, I think you're just fine. And in fact, I would argue to you, because there's no language in section 139 that says otherwise, I think the expenses could be reimbursed at any time. So here we are at the end of May. This catastrophe started as far as the official disaster declaration on March 13th. So, that's what, a month and a half ago, 2.5 months ago. And so you've got these expenses you've incurred during that period of time. If your employer establishes a plan now, you present your statement to the employer, or as the employer, you establish your program and encourage statements from employees, reimburse the expenses.
Yeah, this began on March 13th. When does it go on until the national emergency is lifted?
Yeah, it's exactly right. It will continue until the emergency declaration is reversed. Right now, we are still under the national emergency declaration. Now, we're not all necessarily under stay-at-home orders, all right, because let's distinguish the stay-at-home order from the emergency declaration. President Trump did not issue any stay-at-home orders. All of those orders were issued only and solely by the various state governors. The only thing the president did was declare a national natural disaster on March the 13th.
So let me ask another question then, Dan. And that is that you were talking about employees receiving benefits from employers, right? But let's go through that for a minute. If you're a sole proprietor and have a home-based part-time business, you may not have any employees, but you could employ your spouse, very minimally, maybe 4, 5, 6 hours a week, at even minimum wage. And your spouse then could be your employee, and that could give your family these benefits, right, Dan?
Well, yeah, that's true. If you, as a Schedule C business owner, that is to say, you're not operating as a LLC or a partnership or a corporation, you're just a Schedule C sole proprietor, you still have the right to hire workers. And there's no limitation on who you can hire or what work they can perform, as long as they are performing some work that has valid significance to the business. You can't hire your spouse to sit on the couch and collect a paycheck, all right? Because that's not going to be an ordinary and necessary expense. For purposes of business expenses, the Internal Revenue Code is very clear that the expense has to be ordinary and necessary. But if you hire your spouse to come in and do specifically delineated tasks that are necessary for the success of the business, and you pay your spouse some reasonable compensation for doing that, then that spouse, as an employee of your company, is subject to this reimbursement. No question about that.
And that also, if you are a C corporation or an S corp, and you are the sole owner, the sole shareholder, you could hire yourself as your corporation employee, right? And then
that's exactly right. Yes, you're exactly right, Ron. And in fact, if you are operating as a corporation, whether it's a C corp or an S corp, you are supposed to be paying yourself a reasonable salary for compensation. That's a whole nother rule in the tax code. That's something I talk about in my book, Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide. Because frankly, Ron, it's the single biggest mistake that small business owners make, is not getting themselves set up on a salary properly. And that's one of the most common audit targets there is for the IRS. So everybody on this call that's functioning as a small business needs to know how that operates, so you stay out of trouble with the IRS. But assuming you're paying yourself a salary, you are the employee of the corporation, and you are therefore subject to the 139 reimbursement.
Wow, that's a lot of info. We've covered a lot of ground, and so I just want to say that maybe we've covered more than you can absorb. It's certainly more than I could have absorbed if I was raw on this. I had no knowledge of this whatsoever, and listen to this 1 hour briefing. We're going on an hour. I would absorb it all, but fortunately for you, I guess, I've taught thousands of small business tax deductions I've taught small business tax deductions to thousands of people for 20 plus years. So based on that experience, I get a pretty good idea of what you're going to need.
Ron, you there? I lost you.
Next in order to get the fullest and I have bundled together a package that includes exactly what you will be needing and nothing you won't be needing. There's no fluff in there, nothing to try to jack up the price or anything like that to try to make it look bigger than it is. It's exactly what you need, nothing you don't need. Then I say we slash, but Dan slash the price to the bone. I say Dan because all these materials and the information I'm going to be giving you access to in just a minute are all Dan's. So he slashed the price to the bone to make it affordable to virtually everybody. And here are the things that are in that package. First, you're going to get a special report, 36 pages, I believe it is. It's a plain English guide to understanding this whole thing, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, Economic Security Act. Down the right-hand side of your screen, you see all the things that are included, the Payroll Protection Program and the Economic Disaster Injury Loans and Retirement account distributions. All those things are covered in this document. You're going to get that because these are all, they interplay with you. Like Dan said, if you get the PPP loan, there may not be certain things you can't do under Section 139. So you'll get a full understanding of this by getting this document, which is going to be included in your package. The second thing we're going to do, now this is actually see this package here? It's like 37 pages long. Down at the very bottom on the right-hand side says disaster benefits for employees. Well, that's what this is. That's the explanation of Code Section 139. So that is a part of the program package number one. The reason that you need this, the reason this is important, is because look under the yellow box, important note. If you're a W-2 employee and you have to having to work from home now, your chances are about probably 99 out of 100 that your employer is going to have no clue about Section 139. You're going to have to inform them so that you can ask for these benefits from them. The best way to inform them is to give them this document. So that's why we're giving it to you. And then next spring, you're going to be taking your tax returns to a tax preparer, and they may say, what happened to all that income that you got? This shows up, but it doesn't show up in your tax return. And they're not going to understand Section 139 probably either. So you give a copy to them. So we're going to make sure you have those. You got those copies. Also, we're going to give you this. It's a Section 139 disaster relief payments. It's a summary of key points. So this is from the tax code itself. It goes on and on and references. This is specifically for your tax pro, probably more than your employer. But it gives us all the key points that Dan just pointed out are all identified here. Where exactly they can be found in the tax code. And the part you highlight there, the full text of Section 179, if you want the whole text of that tax code, or if your tax attorney does, your tax preparer does, this is the link. They go to this link and they'll see the entirety of Section 139. We also want to give you this. This is Dan's book, his newest book, in fact, Small Business Tax Guide. This is what's going to keep you out of trouble. This is what's going to make sure that you're doing everything right, because it's not how much you keep. The counts, it is how much you keep the counts, not how much you make. So you want to keep these deductions in your pocket. So if you follow these easy to use guides, step-by-step instructions, you will most likely have bulletproof all of your business tax deductions. So we want to make sure you have a copy of that. You also want this. This is Pillow Talks Taxes is it's an electronic news bulletin. You get it by email, and it comes out maybe 10 or 12 pages long and has 3 or 4 or 5 different topics in each one. And it covers a variety of topics of interest to small business owners. But the last 2 or 3 issues have had something to do with COVID-19. And as clarifications continue to come out, this is how you'll be kept up to date. So as they refine today, I read they just did some redefining of the requirements to qualify for the PPP forgiveness. As those things change, you'll be kept up to date with a subscription. So you get a full year subscription at no additional cost. And finally, we throw this powerful last one in here. You can get a private one-on-one quarter-hour phone consultation with Dan personally. Dan, let me ask you to come back on the call and tell people what kinds of questions can they ask? Can you answer? What kind of value has this provided to other people in the past?
Well, first of all, Ron, let's be clear that this phone conversation is directly with me personally. You're not going to talk to some member of my staff or an associate lawyer. You're going to talk to me personally, and any question that you have about your IRS issues, I can deal with, particularly if you're having IRS collection problems. If you owe money and the IRS is in your face, that's where I live and breathe, as you know, Ron, in the problems resolution world. But if you've got questions about your paycheck protection loan, or if you got questions about 139, or if you got questions about setting up your small business, what kind of entity should you use? One of the chapters in my book, Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide, is understanding the various entities that are available for businesses to operate from, and people have a million questions about that. We talked about the reasonable compensation question. Listen, the Dan Pilla Small Business Tax Guide has been 40 years in the making, Ron. I've got 12 or 15, maybe 16 different issues in there that specifically are IRS target issues that they go after small businesses on. I've litigated every single one of those issues multiple times over the last 40 years, and this book shows you how to stay out of trouble with those issues. So when you read this and you have questions, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? You can use that time, that quarter-hour consultation with me to get clarity on those questions.
Now, if you're sitting there now and thinking, I don't really have a tax question or a problem right now, here's some good news. This free consultation is valid for up to 6 months. You can call in and get an appointment anytime in the next 6 months for that 15-minute consultation. And believe me, I've done this, so I know that if you plan carefully in advance what you want to cover, you can get a lot of questions answered in 15 minutes with Dan, because he's got the answers on top of his head. So I want to this is good for 6 months. This is a powerful component of this package. Now, these are all the things I think you're going to need. So if I can get my slide to move. There we go. So here's the summary. You're going to get this 23-page special report that covers the whole coronavirus emergency stuff, all the federal programs and things like that. You need a 3-page explanation of the tax code section 139, which is part of that special report. You'll get separately, you'll get the complete content of code section 139, plus excerpts of the key points. Your employer is probably going to want the extra for your employer and for you. Your tax pro, who probably reads tax code when he goes to bed, which is why most of them are unmarried, or would want to read the entire section of the code. And you get Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide to stay out of trouble, make sure you're running your business correctly so that you can take advantage of all of these deductions without being in the crosshairs of the IRS. The full-year subscription to Pillow Talk Taxes, which will give you not only additional information on the coronavirus situation as it unfolds, but you also get a look-back period of 3 months. You can go back and look at the prior 3 issues as part of this. So if you want to go, you're really getting 15 months worth of tax education from Dan Pilla with this subscription, and then your quarter-hour consultation. Now, if you, I'm wrapping this up now. If you purchase those separately, I added them up. It comes to a little under $250. But tonight you get all 6 for way less than half price. In fact, we want you to have all of these for $97 flat, plus shipping and handling, which is a small amount. And by the way, that $97 is tax deductible. Brings it down to a net cost of somewhere around $60 or something like that once you deducted it. So that's what we want you to have, because these 6 items here is everything you could need, everything you would likely need in order to maximize the value of the Section 139 deductions. And here's the only place to get it: PillaTaxSpecial.com. And this special, the $97 offer, expires at midnight tonight. This should be a no-brainer for most people. This will apply to most people on this webinar. It also will cause most people to incur not hundreds, probably thousands of dollars worth of tax-free income by understanding how this all works. And we're giving you the whole package of plain English translations of how to make this work. So I just encourage all of you to get on that on the internet and go to PillaTaxSpecial.com tonight before midnight in your time zone. Actually, I'm in Pacific time zone, so you get some extra time if you're on the East Coast. But at midnight, this will all come down. and you'll see a price of $250 up there or something like that. So thank you for being on this call. And Dan, is there anything finally you'd like to say as we wrap up?
Yeah, Ron, I want to say to folks that there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. I don't care what your situation is. We can help you through it. And as I said, I got 40 years of experience in dealing with these situations. I can help you with all of this stuff and more. So take advantage of this. Now, one thing I will say is I conduct these seminars just like we did here for an hour tonight, about 50 minutes of my presentation tonight. We usually charge $149 for tax professionals just for the seminar without even subscribing to the additional information. So you've got a heck of a benefit tonight. Even if you don't spend a nickel, you've got a heck of a benefit. But I'm telling you, this investment of $97 is going to be worth every penny to you, because the book alone, Dan Pilla Small Business Tax Guide, is going to help you stay out of trouble with the IRS with your business.
Thank you, Dan, for the time you spent with us and the knowledge you shared with us. I mean, you and I had known each other like forever. I can't remember when we first met. It's been a long time ago. And it just, one thing I've got to say about you is, as I trust you. When you tell me something about the tax laws, I don't have to wonder, is this really true? And that's worth just weight in gold, so folks. So when you get these materials, you don't have to wonder, is this really real, or is this guy misinterpreting something? Misinterpreting never happens. Dan's been in this business of protecting people against protecting people and defending them against the IRS for like 40 years. And I think it's correct, Dan, to say you've never been audited, right? Why would they want to come after you? Because you know what you beat the hell out of them.
I don't know if I could say. I don't know if I can say that, Ron. They did take a run at me in the late 1980s, but that was the first and only time.
Geez, that's been a long time ago. Well,
Yep.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dan, and for sharing that knowledge with us. Folks, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to let you go now. This is the wind up of this call. It's been exactly 1 hour, almost to the minute. And remember, you've got until midnight to take advantage of the special. So I'm going to end this conference, this webinar tonight, but I'm going to leave this slide up for a few minutes to make sure you get a chance to write down the PillaTaxSpecial.com web address, because you will never see this for $97.